So, with regard to this, as always, we're going to give a bit of the context. But before we do that, don't forget obviously to hit the like button, share if you haven't already. Sharing is caring, and subscribe if you're one of those 5,000 people roughly who watch our video every single month and yet haven't subscribed. I don't know what you're doing, but join the club. The water's lovely out here, and so that's what we're going to do. So now's your opportunity to subscribe. So the Civil War happened, and moderates within the Republican Party, in particular President Abraham Lincoln, they basically wanted, at the beginning of the war, to just do the bare minimum to bring the South back, right? They just wanted to end the rebellion and to bring the states back in. So there was none of this kind of talk about ending slavery at that in those early days. So it wasn't until 1862/63 when you had the Emancipation Proclamation. So what this said was that all slaves within the rebellious states would be freed upon the arrival of Union troops. So whenever the Union troops would liberate a place, if there were slaves there, they would be freed. Now this didn't apply to the border states, which had stayed loyal, right? So places like Maryland, places like Kentucky, places like Missouri. So these states here, which didn't break away from the Union, slavery was still maintained as an institution there. So it wasn't actually the full kind of emancipation. It wasn't like the full end of slavery as such, right? And also, we have to bear in mind that Abe Lincoln, just like many other people, both North and South, were still white supremacists, right? So we spoke earlier about Haiti. Now, Haiti wasn't recognized by the United States until 1862. Now, why was it not recognized until 1862? The reason for this is because had they recognized it before 1862, then this would have given credence to the one successful slave rebellion in history, right? So Haiti, formerly San Domingo, which had been a French colony, right? The slaves there rose up, killed the white people who were there, and instituted their own independent republic. So if the United States had recognized Haiti before this time, it would have given credence to this idea. And so the fear was that the slaves within the South would then use that and then they'd rise up and do a similar thing. But by 1862, the thinking was that if they recognize Haiti, what they can do is basically round up all the slaves and then dump them in Haiti, right? So the 4 million slaves who were in these southern states, basically just get rid of them, right? And then in the future there won't be any kind of problem. So this was kind of what was thought of by Lincoln and many other people. Now, for various different reasons, this didn't end up happening, right? But what did end up happening was that the South was put under military occupation. So as you can see on the map here, these are the different states and these are the different military occupation zones, right? And so during this time, there was a great kind of debate about what ought to be done with these southern states, right? And there's three specific stances, right? One is the reconciliationist route, right? Which is basically saying, okay, what we should do is very lightly punish the South, but realistically what we should do is just allow the states to kind of rejoin as soon as possible and put this whole Civil War mess behind us, right? Then there's the white supremacist stance, which is basically, at worst, either maintaining slavery or, scaling it back. So okay, so instead of there being slavery, instead kind of black people are just basically second-class citizens. But the kind of basic power structures where white people are in control, that's basically maintained. And then the third one, which was the emancipationist one, right? This was predominantly people in the North. These are so-called radical Republicans, because obviously the Republican Party was the party that was opposed to slavery. And that's why the South kind of rose up when Lincoln, the first Republican president, was elected. So for them, they wanted to basically punish the South. And in particular, they wanted to punish the slave owners, right? By confiscating their land and distributing it amongst the newly freed slaves. So this was kind of an idea which the first inklings of it was kind of suggested by General Sherman, where he gave his famous Field Order number 15, I believe, right? And this basically said that the slaves within this liberated territory, which he had, right, would be given 40 acres and a mule. So the idea behind this is basically, right, confiscating the land from the former slavers and then giving it to the slaves, as a means of rebalancing the kind of all the kind of discrimination and all the wrong that was done to the slaves, but also giving them the means to basically take care of themselves, to be kind of independent, fully functioning members of the society, right? So the idea that these people would now become citizens with full voting rights, full economic rights, and would be independent citizens just like everyone else. So this was on the more radical end of it, right? So In the early days, because many of the southern states were not admitted to the Union, what this meant was that the northern states, which were predominantly Republican, they were able to push through quite radical things, and this was known as Reconstruction. So there were three amendments, yeah, which are called the three Reconstruction amendments, and this is the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th. So the 13th Amendment abolished involuntary servitude, yeah. So basically, this ended slavery. However, within that, it said unless it's as a means of punishment. So that's why you still have the prison industrial complex today. So basically, prisoners can still be forced to do involuntary servitude, right? So whether they want to or not, they still can be forced to do that. And actually, in some ways, slavery still continues to today as a result of this tiny little get out clause, right? So this was passed between 1865 and 1866, and the last state which ratified this was the state of Mississippi in, get this, 2013. Right, so obviously it was abolished in like the whole of the United States, including Mississippi, a long time before that. But the idea is still like, you know, it took Mississippi that long to kind of get around to actually ratify this amendment, right? So that was the 13th Amendment. Then you had the 14th Amendment, right? And this gives equal citizenship to all peoples born within the United States. So regardless of where your family were from, regardless of whether they're in form of servitude, if you are born in the United States, you are a US citizen. So even Boris Johnson, who was born in the United States, you know, although he's the UK Prime Minister, if he wanted to, he could apply to be a US citizen, right? And it would be guaranteed that by this birthright citizenship. And then also within the 14th Amendment, it offers equal protection under the law, regardless of race, color, or form of servitude, right? So basically this says that, you know, so regardless of whether you're white or black, etc., etc., everyone is going to be treated equally under the law, and no one can be discriminated because of race or form of servitude, right? So this was passed in 1868. And then finally, you end up having the 15th Amendment, which was passed in 1870. And this is what gave black people equal voting rights, or rather, I should say, black males equal voting rights, because obviously this is a day before women's suffrage, right? So this guaranteed that regardless of race, color, or form of servitude, there was no rules that could be imposed by any states or like by the federal government, yeah, saying that people did not have the right to vote. But there's little get out clauses within that, because what they basically then did in these southern governments is they found other reasons to basically disenfranchise black people. But we'll get onto that a little bit later, right? So as we discussed in some of our other videos, so definitely check those out. Abraham Lincoln was obviously assassinated shortly after the Civil War in 1865. So then what you end up having afterwards was Andrew Johnson, right? Now, Andrew Johnson had been a Southern Democrat. However, he ended up fleeing to the north because he was in favor of maintaining the Union, right? So he was still very much in favor of white supremacy, of maintaining slavery, of all that stuff, right? So everything that the Confederacy stood for, minus, you know, splitting away from the United States. So this is basically what his kind of stance was, right? You know, so as a result of this, he ended up pushing through a lot of vetoes, yeah? So anytime the radical Republicans push through a law like the Civil Rights Act or any of these amendments, he would always try and veto it. However, because of the makeup of the Congress in those days, because as we said, those southern states have not been readmitted back into the Union yet, right? That's how they were able to override his veto. So he was very much a kind of like lame duck president, and they actually tried to impeach him as well, although this was unsuccessful. But kind of gives you an idea of, even at a federal level, there was mass resistance to this, right? But down in the South, yeah, like where they're under military occupation, what you're having was basically white supremacist terrorism. So the Ku Klux Klan, which we all kind of famously know about, right? That was founded in 1866. And although it was eventually crushed in 1871, although obviously it would like re-emerge in different forms over the years, right? So the first Klan, as it was called, was crushed by 1871. But there were other organizations such as the White League and other kind of terrorist organizations, and just kind of mass mobilization, right, against African Americans, right? So there was terrorism both on economic terms, on political terms, and just in civil society terms, right? So the number of lynchings that took place during this time, the amount of like voter suppression, intimidation, everything, right? Houses were burnt down, schools were burnt down, businesses were burnt down. This was a really terrible time. for many African Americans who had only just been freed, right? So the federal government, with its federal troops, like kind of were stationed in the South, and these were the only kind of people who were protecting the rights of African Americans there, right? But still, these African Americans weren't given the just compensation, that they would have needed. And so over time, what you end up having was akin to basically post-war fatigue. So what we have to kind of understand is, obviously by the time it gets to the election of 1876, which we're going to get onto a little bit, right? You're talking about something which happened 11 years after the Civil War. So for many different reasons, people in the North kind of got tired of having to fully occupy the South. In many ways today, it's very similar to, opposition to American involvement in Afghanistan, where you think about it, it's like, okay, right, maintaining troops there, etc., etc., it's very costly, etc., etc. It's been going on for a long time. We should kind of just wrap this thing up. However, the problem, as in that case and in this case, is that as soon as you withdraw those US troops, is that, the local people there basically end up taken over again, and they end up imposing their tyranny onto the rest of the population, right? So this is very similar to kind of what ended up happening in post Reconstruction South. So for various different reasons, after 1873, you end up having more and more control of the South being put back in the hands of the Democratic Party. And don't forget that at this time, the Democratic Party was the party of white supremacy. It was the party of white Southern voters, right? And the Republican Party at that time was the party of the newly freed African Americans, right? So today in the South, it's kind of completely flipped, whereby, especially in some states, overwhelming majority of whites vote for Republicans and the overwhelming majority of blacks vote for the Democrats. But in this time, it was completely flipped. So you end up having the so-called Redeemers, right? So these are white conservative Democrats in the South, and they end up taking more and more control over the next few years, right? Now, this is for many different reasons, So first of all, obviously, you had a lot of corruption within the Grant administration. So many people kind of swayed away from voting for the Republicans because of that. On top of that, you had the Panic of 1873, which is basically a recession. So people in both the North and South had other kind of concerns. They were like, okay, this occupation is kind of costing quite a lot. Let's kind of scale back on this. But on top of that, you end up having more and more terrorism and intimidation, which put black people in their so-called place, right? So this is largely how many of these white Southerners in the South were able to kind of take more and more control away from black people, right? So by the time of the presidential election in 1876, it's not looking good for Republicans, right? So the Democrats under Tilden ends up winning the popular vote by 50.9% of the vote, compared to Rutherford B. Hayes, who gets just 47.9% of the popular vote. However, when it comes to the Electoral College, which remember is actually how the president is elected in America, in this election, the Democratic Party had 184 Electoral College votes and needed 185 in order to win. But there were 3 states that were up for debate, right? So one of them was Florida, the other was Louisiana, and the third was South Carolina, right? So these states were up in question, and basically many of the Democrats kind of threatened that there'd be a second civil war if they weren't handed the election. So what they end up being is basically a backroom deal, which is the so-called Compromise of 1867, which African Americans to this day still call the Great Betrayal. So the reason for this is because they said, okay, right, you as the Republicans can win this election, right? We'll give you these 3 states. However, the military occupation of the South has to end. So Rutherford B. Hayes ends up becoming the next president. However, for all intents and purposes, as people have said, the North won the Civil War and the South won Reconstruction, right? So this ended up marking the end of Reconstruction. So the federal troops were withdrawn from the South. So the voter suppression and intimidation of African Americans in the South, which had already started, now just went into overdrive, right? And this is why eventually you end up having the Jim Crow laws, which were put in over the next few decades. And so within this, we're going to ask the question of what would have happened if basically the Compromise of 1867, this great betrayal, hadn't been allowed to happen, right? And the Republican Party in the North has stood on principles. And so that's what we're going to look into now. So first of all, we have to kind of look at the situation post-Civil War. So black people for the first time were able to vote, and they were able to stand for Congress, right? And they were able to stand for for senators, for governorships, and for like the state legislature within their own states. So looking at some of the data here, yeah, we can see in 1867, this is some of the representation within those states. So in the state of Louisiana, right, 50% of the population there were white, and yet just 36% of the delegates, yeah, within that state were white, right? Now we're going to look at South Carolina, so 41% white population, 39% of the delegates there are white, right? So you can really see in these two states, if anything, it's either level or it's kind of, if anything, like whites are being underrepresented, right? Now we're going to start to look at Florida, right, which was the third of these three states we mentioned earlier. So 51% of the population there is white, and 61% of the representatives there are white. But now it starts to get very much, this is where we start to realize that there's a little bit more going on, right? Which is this. So the state of Virginia, 58% of the population there is white. However, 76% of the delegates are white. In Mississippi, so just 46% of the population there are white, and yet 80% of the delegates there are white, right? So that's a little bit suspicious, very, very suspicious, right? So even in these early days, all the way back in 1867, which is just 2 years after the Civil War, we're already starting to see there's some suspicious behavior. Now look at Georgia, where it's 54% white, 80% of the delegates are white. Then we look at Alabama, 52% white, 85% of the delegates are white. In North Carolina, it's 63% white and 89% of the delegates are white. And then in Texas, where 69% of the population are white, 90% of the delegates there are white. So you can really kind of see from this, yeah, even in these early days of Reconstruction, that in some of the states, black people were getting a fair share in terms of like the representation. However, in some of these other states, obviously there's going to be some disparities. Even in present day, there's some disparities between the state's population and the number of representatives there. But something to kind of bear in mind is when the gap is this big, like in states like Mississippi, where it's 46% to 80%, somewhere there you can see there's a bit of discrepancy. So now let's look at the census of 1870, just to give us a bit of a kind of like background to this, right? Because this is the kind of, this is the census before the election of 1876, this is how the districts were drawn up. So in South Carolina, 59% of the population there are African American, but just 50% of the population there voted for the Republicans. Now, bearing in mind, as we've said, in the South, the Democrats are the party of white supremacy, and the Republican Party are mainly voted for by black people, right? So it seems quite strange already in this state of South Carolina that in a state where it's 59% of the population are black, that 50% of the state's population would vote for that, right? So why would black people be voting for a white supremacist party? Seems a bit strange, right? Then when we compare the state of Louisiana, which had 50% of the population being black, you can see that 52% of the population voted for the Republican Party. So bear in mind that, these are one of the places where the military occupation is still kind of largely kind of like being held up. And you can see, as in the first case, yeah, you can see that black people seem to be getting a decent level of representation, especially in the state of Louisiana. Then when we compare it to Florida, where there's 49% of the population there are African American, we can see that 51% of the population there vote for the Republicans, right? So in these three states, these are the three states being contested, and yet why are they being contested? Yeah, it doesn't seem to be any kind of shenanigans going on, But what we're going to get into now is some of the other states, right? And bear in mind that many of these states are the same ones which we highlighted in 1867. So let's just look out for them, right? So Mississippi, again, right? 54% of the population there is African American, and yet just 32% of them in this election vote for the Republicans. Now, bear in mind that in the previous election in 1872, 63% of that state population voted for Republicans, right? So it's a bit of a shift, right? Now, I know obviously many of the whites in many like states and stuff weren't allowed to vote because, if they'd served like in the Confederacy, like there was different rules, etc., for a short time after the Civil War. But it seems quite strange that from 1872 to 1876, there's that much of a turnover. So it goes from being, 63% Republican to being just 32%, right, in the space of one election. So it seems like there's a bit of shenanigans kind of going on, right? Then when we look at Alabama, we can see a similar thing, and also within the state of Georgia, we also see a similar thing, right? So many of these states are very, very suspicious, right? And if we look at these states here, where you have either a majority of the population being African American, or at very least a large plurality, when these states somehow end up going to the Democratic Party, it's very, very suspicious, right? So Georgia, for instance, being 46% black, and yet just 28% of the population vote for the Republican Party, seems a little bit suspicious. And Alabama as well, where it's like almost 48% of the population being black and just 40% vote for the Republican Party, seems a little bit suspicious in these states, right? So you can already see that even by the election of 1876, there's already foul play, right? So what the investigation really should have been is not focusing on those three states here of Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina, where it seems to be okay, right? In actual fact, what it should have been is these three other states, right? Which is Georgia, Mississippi, and Alabama. These are the three states which there seem to be quite a lot of suspicion over. And actually, if we combined these 6 states, which we're kind of looking at, right, where there seems to be some level of foul play and stuff, right, if all of those went to the Republican Party, well, then this election wouldn't have been very close in terms of electoral college votes. As a matter of fact, it instead would be 214 electoral college votes to the Republican Party to just 155 for the Democrats. So yes, okay, the Democrats won like the popular vote, but actually, if we look at like one election to the next, again, I'm very dubious of that. I'm very suspicious of that, because clearly there seems to have been some level of voter suppression in some of these states for like black voters. So more likely than not, that popular vote isn't actually representative of what was actually on the ground and stuff, right? So that's something to really bear in mind.